Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're here, March. Where has the month gone? We're halfway through. And welcome to History Cafe, creating a hopeful future for the Puget Sound. Thanks for coming here tonight on this beautiful evening, and thank you to those of you who are tuning in from the Facebook live stream. I'm Sora, I work here in public programs at MOHI, and for those of you who are low or no vision audience members, I'm a mixed white and East Asian person with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing a white shirt, blue vest, and brown pants. A couple housekeeping notes before we begin. If you need a restroom, go back to the cafe, and they are to the left of the deli case. So they're there. And we're so excited to present History Cafe in partnership with History Link on the third Wednesday of every month, so you can find us here. A brief schedule of events. We're going to start with a little talk by David, then we're going to have a little trivia, woohoo, some Q&A, and then we'll have a book signing at the very end. So it'll be a really great night to learn about human and natural history of the Puget Sound, these waters that we all share, we love, and many of us are lucky to call home. And when we think about our relationship to this place, it's really important to also know the history. And so as part of that, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, but today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about whose land you're on, whether that's from here in the Puget Sound region or anywhere across the United States or Canada. So without further ado, our speaker tonight is David B. Williams, an author, naturalist, tour guide, and curatorial associate at the Burke Museum. He's the author of Home Waters, A Human and Natural History of the Puget Sound. We're in for a real treat tonight, so without further ado.
Thank you. It is an honor and pleasure to be here tonight, and hopefully I'll be able to make technology work. Let's see if I get my first. Okay. Woo-hoo. Yay. All right, so everything will be good after this. As I said, an honor and pleasure. I'd like to thank Sora for asking me and for the MOHI staff for all that you do for history of this region. I'm sure like many of you, you've been going to this place for many, many years. I remember going as a child when it was over in Montlake, and they have the, it's not a parachute, periscope. I think they're different. And looking at that and seeing the fire and all those other really cool things. So it's great, this connective tissue of this place. So I have lived here for most of my life, fortunately. And for the last 25 years or so, I have lived and focused on the history of both human and natural history of this region. And I've tried to do this really through a single lens of what is our connection to place? How are we influenced by landscape, and how does the landscape influence us? And I've done this through a variety of books. You can see there's about 6 book covers on the screen before you, ranging from a little book called Cairns that looks at rocks, little heaps of rocks, to my most recent one, Home Waters, which I will be talking about tonight. And as the title says, the goal or an aspect of it is thinking about hope. And so let me just tell you a little bit more about this book. The picture in front of you, the classic view of Puget Sound with Mount Rainier. And as I said, I grew up in this area, and for most of my writing career, I was very land-focused, writing about things such as the Denny Reed Grade, or writing about the geology of buildings, or thinking about geese or crows. And I hadn't really thought about water, even though I have lived by water for most of my life. So a handful of years ago, I began thinking about the process of this book. And what I started to do, and what I often do with books, is I started asking questions. I reached out to historians, to biologists, to tribal members, to try and understand what were the stories that were central to this place. How did we define this landscape? How can we learn from and learn about the landscape that's out there? And so what I did was get the stories and then try, I hope, tell them in a way that makes them sort of fun. And I want to just sort of work my way through the book and think about some of the issues that I write about and give you a little bit, I guess, hints of the chapters. Not enough that you don't want to buy the book, because you do. My mom says it's a really good book. So, and I know there's one member of the audience, my friend Jen says it's good, and she's really smart. So Jen says it's a good book, so you should buy it. And I'll give you the 20 later. So when I began, I had a central question. What is Puget Sound? And this map that shows the region of Puget Sound, you can see this blue line that goes all the way around it. And what it's going around is the watershed of Puget Sound. And this is actually the official definition of Puget Sound by the state, so that everything that all the precipitation that falls within that blue line, within that watershed, ends up in Puget Sound. From the top of Mount Rainier all the way out to Cape Flattery, up to the Canada border, is Puget Sound, what you might think of as Greater Puget Sound. And I really like that definition because it acknowledges a central aspect of the story of Puget Sound, is that each of us, no matter where we live, if we are within that watershed, we are part of Puget Sound. What we do on the land affects Puget Sound. So when you flush the toilet after drinking your coffee, that ends up in Puget Sound. When you dump your pharmaceuticals, if you put biological stuff, if you put material on your yard, everything ends up in Puget Sound. We are part of that story, even if we are not in the water. We are part of the water of the Sound. And that's really, as I said, the sort of Greater Puget Sound. The book primarily focuses on the area south of Admiralty Inlet, between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island, what I like to think of as Puget Sound proper. And most of the stories take place down in that area. And this term Puget Sound, of course, is a very new term. The oldest term we know comes from Lushootseed, the native language of the main part of the Sound, and that term is Hwolge, mostly mispronounced by me because I do that all the time. But it means saltwater, of the saltwater. And it's less a cartographic or a geographic term and much more of a connective tissue, in the sense that the people who use that term felt and feel that they are of the Hwolge, they're of the saltwater. Their lives revolve around the saltwater. And there's an ethnographer in the area in the early 1900s who interviewed a variety of indigenous people. And he found an interesting little term, and I hope I don't offend anyone with this, but he found this term that those people who lived along the saltwater, who thought they were maybe of higher breeding, better than those who lived in the freshwater, who didn't live on the Hwolge. If you wanted to insult someone, you would say, oh, if you're lower breeding, you're like that person from yonder Issaquah. So I hope there's no Issaquite, Issaquanians. I don't even know what you all are called. But I didn't make it up. I'm just telling you the truth. But the term Puget Sound, of course, is a very new term. This term was coined in May of 1792 by George Vancouver. He came in to, see if I can get my air, he came in down the Strait of Juan de Fuca and took that right turn at Admiralty Inlet, becoming the first known European to do so, or at least the members of his crew. And they sailed down and they anchor off a small little point sticking out that they named Restoration Point, just across Puget Sound from what is now Seattle. And Captain Vancouver sends his lieutenant, Peter Puget, south in with a couple of other members in a couple of boats. They head down to the south end of the Sound, they paddle around, they explore, they talk to people, they take notes, they get back to the ship. And Puget talks to his captain, and later, at the end of May, Vancouver writes, to honor his exertions, I name this Puget's Sound. And that's the origin of the term. And it was mostly the area just south of Seattle and really south of Tacoma was Puget Sound. Admiralty Inlet was the rest of the waterway. And obviously that's changed over time. And I think one of the things that we probably all experience is how names change and evolve over time with place. So what we further know, of course, is that Vancouver, who in the early history books is described as George Vancouver discovered Puget Sound in 1792. Well, he was about probably 13,000 years too late to discover it. We know from evidence over on the east side of Lake Washington in Redmond that there were people living in that area. So the upper part of the slide that shows these projectile points, that came from this dig over in the Bear Creek area. And it's believed that the people who were there were working the stone to make a variety of different tools. They were there for several thousand years. And at the time, when they arrived, to me it's really incredible to think about the fact that they got here fairly soon after the end of the Ice Age. We know that ice moved into this area from Canada, came between the Olympics and the Cascades, made it down to a little bit past Olympia, and then retreated or melted back to the north. Getting far enough out by about 15,500 years ago that salt water could flow in and form Puget Sound. So just a couple thousand years after, people arrive here. And they find a landscape that is much more open, much more savanna-like than what we have right now. Not till about 5,000 years ago did the climate get to the point where you had what I think of sort of as the holy trinity of trees, Doug firs, cedars, and hemlock covering this lowland area. So the people adapt to the landscape. They initially were probably hunting some of the ungulates up in the mountains, but then, and in the plain open area, but then by about 5,000, they really start focusing on salmon and fish and the waterway in this area. So those are the earliest arrivals, and obviously people continue to live here. Then you have the arrivals of, interestingly, not the British, but the Spanish are the next group to arrive in this area. And you'll notice on the left side of the slide, this list of names based on origin of origin, I guess, the derivation from who gave the name to the landscape. But I think it's always fascinating to realize how many Spanish names we have at the north end of Puget Sound. And I know growing up here, I did not learn anything about the Spanish history in this area. So they arrive here, they then end up leaving. Vancouver comes in, we see the effect of him, his names on a variety of places in the landscape. We then have eventually the first people of U.S. citizenry, the Wilkes expedition, they come in and leave this whole host of names. And you can, on the two bottom images, one showing a ship from the Vancouver expedition and one from the Wilkes expedition, just those classic big-masted ships that sailed down and spent time in this area. But to me, what was interesting was thinking about how did all these different groups interact with the landscape? How did they interact with each other? And what was that connection to place? Because that's what I'm always interested in, is how did these people live in the landscape and interact with each other? Of course, if you live in a landscape, you probably have some connection to wanting to defend the landscape. So the two maps here, the one on the right, which shows the forts, but from the United States, or even a little bit United States forts, and then the ones on the left, the map on the left, shows defensive sites of indigenous people. And I have been interested at the north end of the Sound, Fort Worden, Fort Casey, Fort Flagler. What were those? Why were those things there? What was that triangle of fire? And of course learned that that triangle of fire was built to protect Puget Sound from enemy invaders. And it was completely successful. There were no enemy invaders. Of course, they never fired a single shot, and they were obsolete the day they were, all the guns were up, because the ships could shoot much further than the guns from land. So that's a whole other issue. But it was about, to me, this defending place is about going from a place being maybe a place you're starting to settle to becoming home, to becoming the landscape that you care enough about to protect and defend. And certainly, indigenous people, thousands of years doing that. We see that, of course, with the forts. And if you think about it, we're still doing that. We're still trying to defend the place we love from different types of invaders, whether it is green crabs coming in or just the changes in the landscape. We are still concerned about protecting this place we love. And I think that's part of living in a place, is developing that relationship that leads you to want to protect the landscape. This image, it's nice that the sun is setting on the sun setting painting of Mount Rainier with the trees and the water. But what you'll notice about this in the middle is a canoe. And to me, that is what makes this image, is the canoe. And I like it because for thousands of years, this culture, this region was defined by canoes. Those canoes are what knit together the landscape. People could live anywhere in this body of water and stay connected via the canoe. One thing that's great about Puget Sound is it's really relatively benign landscape. I mean, think about living in the Gulf Coast. You know, it's hot, it's muggy, yuck. They've got hurricanes, those aren't fun. What do we have? We've got a little bit of fog, it rains every once in a while from, October to April. But that's a whole other issue. But it's really, we don't have big waves, we don't have hurricanes, it's not really cold like the East Coast. Coming into Puget Sound through Admiralty Inlet, no problem. Try entering the mouth of the Columbia River, the deadliest spot in the oceans. So we have this really great waterway for people to move through, and that has been central to the story of this area. So for thousands of years, canoe culture. Then in the 1830s, we get a fundamental change, and that is the arrival of steamships. The first one is the Beaver that arrives for the Hudson's Bay Company, and it lives up to its name. It went through wood like you wouldn't believe. They would spend something like 12 hours cutting wood for 200 miles of travel. So they would travel, they'd take a break, they'd travel, they'd take a break. It wasn't really efficient. But it showed to the people that you could live in this landscape. And to live in this landscape, one thing that you could benefit from was having that steamship. And out of that develops the classic mosquito fleet, this A to Z list of different types of mosquito fleet vessels shown here. And when you think about the mosquito fleet, I don't know how much you know, but it was sort of this armada of vessels that went everywhere in the Sound. And I've often been asked, well, could you describe a mosquito fleet vessel? And you're probably familiar with Justice Potter Stewart when he was asked to define pornography. Like, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Same thing with this. These ships all more or less look alike. If you really want to know, and we wanted to do a field trip, which I don't think Sora really wants me to do, is you would just turn your heads to the left and look at that white vessel, the Virginia 5. This is one of only 2 mosquito fleet vessels still in existence. And if you look, or if you look on the screen of these ones, they're generally pointy-ended, flat-bottomed, made of wood, steam-powered, and propeller-driven. But there's a whole host of design. I mean, if you look at the Black Prince in the upper left corner, it's a little bit sketchy, looking like, would you really want to be on that boat? Or then you get the Yosemite down here at the bottom, 290 some feet long, beautiful, elegant. So this whole array of ships. And again, they knit together community. They allowed people to live wherever they wanted in the Puget Lowland area and stay connected. It really was sort of the Uber, the Amazon truck, the Metro bus service, the bank, the gossip, the grocery mill, everything in these boats. And if you wanted one, you could either flag it down and it would pull into a dock that maybe you had built. And this is one thing that really fascinated me, is I'm sure you've noticed, when you're out in the Sound, on the shore, you'll see pilings going out into the water. I'm like, what are those pilings doing? My guess is that it was one of these stops in the mosquito fleet. Later, Sora's going to lead a sing-along, a song that they've composed with all of the different titles, right? Yeah? Good, thank you. And there'll be a quiz. That's the whole trivia, is to name as many of these as you can. So there's approximately 350 some odd names, but every single name on here was an official stop of some Mosquito Fleet vessel in the Puget Sound area, the greater Puget Sound area you can get to. So just astounding where you could live and how you could stay connected well before the road system because of that idea of Puget Sound, if you will, as a maritime highway. Then everything changes. Sadly, it all changes with the rise of the automobile. And Sora, I'm going to need your help in a second. I'll give you a high sign or a low sign or some sign. Everything starts to change with the arrival of the car. And with that, we see the death of the Mosquito Fleet. As I said, there are only two left, the Virginia 5 and the Carlisle 2 over on in Bremerton. If you want to ride it, it's really wonderful, $2. You can ride a Mosquito Fleet vessel, older than the Virginia 5. But with the death of the Mosquito Fleet, we have the rise of the ferry system, and in particular, the rise of the Black Ball Ferry. And if we can make it work, I'd love to just play a little song for you. On the Black Ball Ferry line up in Seattle, where the sun shines out and shines up in Seattle, all the wheels go and the sails go, and the ferry boats are chugging right along, right along. All the people love to ride the blue Pacific on the Black Ball Ferry line to the Pacific, where the wheels go and the sails go, and the ferry boats are chugging right along, right along.
Up on the upper deck, the view is great by head. You love your gallantry and you're in Clover. And when the whistles blow, you hate to go below, 'cause that's the signal that the fun is nearly over.
On the Black Ball Ferry line up in Seattle, every single GOP and Democrat will hear those whistles go and the bells go as the ferry goes to turn right along. So, I'm personally quite a big fan of that song, and you all know who sang it? Bing Crosby, excellent. So one thing that's fabulous about Bing Crosby is that he actually has a connection to the Mosquito Fleet. His grandfather, great uncle, was a Mosquito Fleet captain. So ties in very connected. It's just such a wonderful song. I love the GOP and Democrat. So the other thing that and so obviously Black Ball's gone, and we have the modern ferry system. And as the map shows here, it shows all the different ferries that run in Puget Sound. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with the washed out ones, which something like 95%, 98% of the people ride. But I was surprised when I started looking at all the different ferry lines. Kitsap County runs them out to over Bremerton, Port Orchard area. There's the Pierce County one that which goes to Steilacoom and Ketron and Anderson Island. Make sure you don't get on the other one that docks there, which if you know what's down there, you know why I say that. Whatcom County has Lovey Island Ferry. That one, when you get on, they usually charge you once you're on the ferry, which is sort of fun. Guaymas, King County. Then there are the private ferry lines. And when I was working on the book, I wanted to be a completist. I have a little bit anal nature. So I thought I was going to try and ride every single ferry in Puget Sound. And to me, a ferry is a regularly scheduled boat. So I contacted the people who ran the Decatur Island Ferry. And it's a homeowners association. And I said to them, I enunciated very clearly, I said to them, I was wondering if I could ride your ferry. And they said, you cannot get on our ferry boat. I said, okay. So I went to the Gedney Hat Island ferry crew, said the same thing, and they said, sure, you can get on the ferry, but you can't get off the ferry on our island. We don't want you. So I thought, okay, that's cool, but they did sing Happy Birthday to the Captain, which I had never seen on a ferry before. Then the Heron Island, the very south end of the Sound. They said, sure, you can get on the ferry, you can get off the ferry on our island, and then you can get back on the ferry to get off our island. So I thought that was pretty nice, so I got to go on and off. But when I was there, I was waiting in line for the ferry. Line sort of an overstatement, I was waiting in the parking lot. This truck pulls up, guy gets out, drives 3 John Deere riding mowers off the truck, parks in the parking lot. Ooh, what's up with that? Well, ferry comes in, 3 people get off the ferry, they go over, they fire up their John Deere lawnmowers and drive them onto the ferry. Which, have you ever seen anyone drive a John Deere lawnmower? I thought that was pretty cool. So if you ever get a chance, I know they really don't want you, but you could probably show up. I'm sure maybe it's like some competition, I don't know. And then the final one was the Jetty Island Ferry. I know there's a couple more ferries, but the highlight, though, for me of riding the ferries was I got to spend time with one of the ferry boat captains, a woman named Marcia Morse. And Marcia made to me a very profound statement about the ferry system. She said, I grew up in eastern Washington, and I was used to those big open views of landscape. And I had this spiritual connection to place through those open views, that big landscape. And she said, when I moved over to the west side, I lost that a bit. And we've all hiked in the forest around here, and we know you can get in the trees, which is beautiful, but not always the big open view. She said, though, when I'm out on the ferry, I always try and look up a bit and have that big view, that big open view. And that to me is really an essential part of the story of the Sound, is that the ferry system, yes, it's incredibly practical. Point A to point B, knitting together communities, but there's also that spiritual connection of being out on the water that we don't always get in this area. So that to me, I think, is one of the wonderful, I think often overlooked aspects of the Sound. So let me do a big switch and talk about natural history. And the 2 images, the one image which shows a whole gathering of herring, and then another one with herring drying on a dock. Herring are, as one biologist said to me, they are the hub around which Puget Sound revolves. And by that he meant that they are this forage fish, one that everybody eats. And when they are in the waters here, particularly during the time when they're what's the term? Spawning. Thank you. Spawning. It's just this riot of life that animals are coming. You see birds, you see mammals. It's just really amazing. I'll show you a photo in a second. But there is also this incredibly deep cultural connection. I think we often are described as a salmon nation, but if you look in the archaeological record, herring are just as ubiquitous and just as abundant as salmon for thousands of years in this area. So very key connection to the story of this place. If you ever have a chance to see a spawning event, they're sort of going on right now on Hood Canal. It's pretty wonderful. The upper image, which shows sort of some kelp, and then the tan up there, those are all herring eggs that have washed up on shore. And then the lower photo with all the birds in it. I mean, it's just stunning to see how much life there is, these gatherings. And I have not seen it, but I know I've seen photos when the spawning occurs and the water turns turquoise. It's just amazing that there's that much life in this area. And we really shouldn't be surprised. This area is so incredibly bountiful. And I'll come back to herring a little bit of the story in just a second. Then there are rockfish. In case you had not realized, I'm just going to stand in front of the screen for a second. This vest is rockfish. My wife made this vest for me. I mean, she fabric that made it. But rockfish are totally cool. There's a dozen or so, 10 or 12 different species up on the screen here, ranging from the yellow and black china to the sort of the vermilion rockfish, I guess you could call it. They're really amazing. There are 27 species of rockfish in the single genus Sebastes, which means magnificent. No other fish in the area comes close to that. They live throughout the entire water column, from the bottom all the way up to the top. You find them in the deepest waters of the Sound and all the way up. They're just this amazing fish. Some of them are about the size of a pocketbook. The biggest ones are about 3 feet long. Real amazing fish. But they illustrate a central part of the story of Puget Sound. You're probably familiar with the Bolt decision in the 1970s that restored treaty rights of salmon to indigenous people. Well, one result of that is that state biologists and federal biologists really pushed non-native fishers to go for other fish than salmon. And one of the groups they pushed was rockfish. The problem was we didn't understand much about rockfish. So again, another wonderful picture of a rockfish. And then on the right is a bone, and I'm going to come back to this bone in a second. So we didn't understand about rockfish. And this is where one aspect of hope really began for me in working on this book. And you might think writing a book about Puget Sound with its many problems, you might come away with a lack of hope. And I actually came away with hope. And that's what I really want to sort of focus on, these different aspects of it throughout the rest of the talk. But as I started to learn more about rockfish, they realized a fundamental difference between rockfish and many other fish, and something they did not know about rockfish. So when they pushed fish to be caught, rockfish, the populations were completely hammered. Unfortunately, we have 2 species of rockfish that are on the federal list of threatened and endangered species. The reason that they got hammered is we did not understand their life history. We long thought that they were fairly short-lived fish, but they discovered that these are fish that do not start reproducing until their teenage years. They can live to be 50, 75, 100, 150. The oldest rockfish, 205 years old. And the older they get, the more prolific they get. Don't think too much, really. But how do you tell the age of a rockfish? So the little bone that's on the right is an ear bone. And like a tree, they put down a new layer every year. And if you if you get an otolith and you polish it and you count the rings, it's hard to tell. There's a 2-millimeter scale here, so that bone is maybe only a 1/4 inch. So it takes someone who's very precise. But once they acquired that knowledge, this is where hope comes from, is it's really created better management of these animals. We are starting to see the population slowly start to bounce back. Because it's a long-lived population, this is not going to happen quickly. But with this better knowledge, we are better managers. We see the same thing with herring. As we've begun to understand the biology of these fish better, we are becoming better managers. And I recognize that there are many challenges and many problems, but we are headed in a better direction. And it's really strongly due to these better science that's taking place with many of the species in the waterway. Then there are gooey duck and Olympia oysters. The gooey duck on the right wearing the top hat and waving, I don't know if that's in his or her arm. Oysters are interesting because they can go back and forth between being male and female, so I'm not sure. And then the 2 gentlemen on the left holding up the gooey duck. These are the 2 funniest guys. I love these 2 gentlemen. But gooey duck illustrates another part of the story that gives me hope. And so Olympia oysters, which really illustrate to me the early story of Puget Sound. They're one of the first resources that were taken out of the Sound and taken someplace else. Also one of the first resources that was really hammered. And I think that's the early story of Puget Sound. People arrived in this area with this mindset of use and exploitation of the natural resources. And I think that persisted, and I know it persisted for decades upon decades. But in the last 30, 40, 50, 40 years in particular, we have made a fundamental change. And I would argue that the way people primarily view Puget Sound right now is through the lenses of sustainability and stewardship. And we see this with gooey duck. Gooey duck are completely regulated, the population of them. They are arguably the most abundant animal in Puget Sound, something like 400 million gooey duck. If you wonder where your state money goes, biologists counting them. But they're very regulated. What happened was there was a big change in the 1960s. Divers in Hood Canal discovered that gooey duck were not just intertidal organisms. Gooey duck is from the Lashutsi, to dig deeper, meaning to dig deeper. If you've ever tried to catch one, you know what that means. But they now know that if you go into the Sound and you dive down, and you get as far down as 300 feet deep in Puget Sound, you will find gooey duck living down there. And so they're very regulated. You can only harvest them between about 18 and 80 feet underwater. That's one way you harvest them. The other way you harvest them is through farming. So the image on the lower right shows these tubes that they put the young gooey duck in. Have any of you seen a baby gooey duck? Oh my God. They are the cutest little animal. I know you think there's no way, because the adults, scary. But the little babies are about the size of a pinto bean, and they have a little neck that just sort of wiggles. If you ever have a chance, seek them out. I'm not saying like you should raise them as pets, but they're really cute. So they put them in there and then they harvest them. But primarily, much of the geoduck duck that's harvested, I think more than half of it, is from live geoduck ducks, where they dive down. I was lucky enough to go out with the Suquamish divers. So the image on the left shows sort of the classic image of a scuba diver, and then these three gentlemen who are, this is a net with about 250 pounds of geoduck duck that have been harvested. So they dive down wearing these big diving suits, bring them up to the surface. But it's very regulated, and once an area has been harvested, the state monitors it and does not allow geoduck duck harvesting until it has been restored back to its more natural state. So to me, this aspect of stewardship and sustainability versus exploitation is really exemplified by this. And now we're seeing with Olympia oyster a lot more work on restoration. So it's quite wonderful to see that too. Then there are salmon and orca, the classic species of Puget Sound. Several species of salmon, two different groups of orca, the orca on the right and the salmon on the left. The orca, which have the southern residents, which are the fish eaters, and the bigs, which are the mammal eaters. Those two groups live in the Sound. And then the salmon. And what struck me about these animals as I started looking at them and thinking about them is the fact that each of them are homebodies. They always return to this area. And the reason I think part of that is that these animals evolved in this landscape, the ones that live here. As I said, Puget Sound's only about 15,500 years old. So at that time, the salmon and the orca come in, and these animals adapt to the landscape. And in essence, the way I like to think of it is they have the DNA of Puget Sound sort of in their bodies, within their bloodstreams. They come back they always return to this area. And that's given them a certain amount of resilience. Again, I recognize the challenges, but think about the Elwha dams out on the Olympic Peninsula. Those two dams are taken down, and almost immediately, salmon return to the waterway. And I was talking to a biologist who studied that area for many years and studied salmon. He said, the reason the salmon were able to do that is because they've been doing it for thousands of years. They have been dealing with landslides and earthquakes and changes in the environment. And there is this resiliency in them. And I think as we are becoming better at recognizing that, we are becoming better at giving them the opportunity to do so. Again, so another aspect to me of hope of this story of this waterway. So I want to end by looking at kelp. To me, this is a classic image of kelp, shoreline covered in what looks like spinach along the waterway. And I knew nothing about kelp. I had lunch one day with the sort of kelp guru, and I was converted to a kelpophile, a kelp evangelist. I'm not sure how you'd actually. Good luck doing that word. Sorry. But kelp are amazing. And again, like herring, one of these overlooked aspects of the waterway. And I would argue that from a cultural point of view, the longest connection we have with any plant or animal in the waterway is with kelp. And this is where it comes from. I'm not sure if you've heard of this idea of the kelp highway. So people coming from the old world, coming from Asia, coming across, as you can see on the map, the land bridge, and then into North America, long thought to come down sort of maybe through this ice-free corridor. But they're now pushing this idea of a kelp highway, that people would travel along the waterway, taking advantage of these kelp forests, that kelp grow very densely. They have a very complex ecosystem, which I'll come back to in a second. But they would travel along that waterway, and then one of the off-ramps of the kelp highway was Puget Sound, maybe 13, maybe 14,000 years ago. So we have this deep, deep connection to these, to this group of plants. Classic example, a rope on the right, and then the image on the left showing how you would make a halibut hook by taking a bulb, a kelp bulb, and steaming wood in it and then bending it. So people also would use kelp for food, of course, and then they would also lay them on the sides of the canoes. And so when you put your paddle down, the paddle was quieted by resting on kelp instead of directly upon the wood there. So we have about 24 species of kelp, and the kelp here really does form a forest in the water, and it really is equivalent to the terrestrial rainforest with this overstory, the classic bull kelp, and giant kelp, and then all these understory species that give this three-dimensionality to the kelp forest. So you can see in these images. And then you can, the aspect about it is this incredible diversity of life. Whether you have urchins, sea stars, you have different crabs, abalone, fish, orca, all of them going into that waterway. Rockfish in particular, when they're young, take advantage of it. And we're starting to see, as we understand the relationship between rockfish and kelp, the biologists are working to protect both together, not as a separate entity, but together, recognizing that linked nature of the ecosystem. But the other thing that's fascinating about it is how kelp spreads through the ecosystem. You may be familiar with the idea that the terrestrial rainforests really grow on salmon. You've probably heard this idea. The salmon are born in the rivers, they head out to the ocean, they acquire nutrients, they come back, they die, they get eaten, they get excreted, the nutrients spread through the ecosystem. If you look at plants and animals associated in the waterways, you will see this signature of kelp throughout many of them and in surprisingly high percentages. So just a phenomenally important aspect of the ecosystem that we have here. I love this image of this little seal cruising through this beautiful waterway here. And I want to end by just sort of sum up thinking about the idea of hope and why I really have it. As I said, central to it is this idea of science, that as we are learning more about the ecosystem, we become better managers. This change in how we perceive this waterway, from exploitation to the recognition of this incredible beauty and this need for sustainability and stewardship. But I also think I'm strongly hopeful by how important Indigenous people are becoming in the story of management of this place. That their decisions, these thousands of years of knowledge, are being shared and sort of fingering out through the rest of the community as we see better ways to manage this place. And as I said, I use this word hope. And hope is one of those, it's a 50-cent word in some ways. Oh, I hope the Mariners win a game this year, whatever you hope, I don't know. But for me, this hope that I believe in is a hope that is based on a lot of effort. It's based on hard work, it's going to be based on money, it's going to be based on knowledge, it's going to be based on our concern for this place. And it's going to be based on us, each one of us making an impact. I think we're often told that an individual doesn't make a difference, that it's corporate or it's government. But I like to switch that around and think of it as everything I do makes a difference. I am part of the story here. What I do is connected to all these tissues out through the landscape. My story is part of the story of this place. Your story is part of the story of this place. It's what makes Puget Sound an amazing landscape. Not just the natural beauty, but that cultural cohesion, those cultural communities that are woven throughout this lovely waterway. Thank you. Sora's going to do something. You're trivia, right? Are they next? Are they on here? Oh my gosh. Okay. You want me to read?
Yeah, I'll give a little.
Okay, good, because I'm going to lose.
Okay, here's my plan. Stick with me. I think we're going to do it, raise your hand if you know the answer. First person to raise their hand and answer it right, you get a little prize. There's going to be 5 questions, 4 multiple choice, and then the last one is free response. So,
What's that?
Yeah.
It's sort of like Seder, Manish Tanahalalan. The oldest archaeological evidence for people in Puget Sound was found in Redmond and dates from at least 12,500 years ago. What is it? A, hundreds of pieces of rock used to make tools. B, bones from a giant sloth with an embedded antler projectile point. C, pieces of a canoe.
Oh, are you first in the tie?
I'm going to go with B.
Bones? Oh no, there is some that's controversial. That's debated. It's a key point. I'm going to choose a different answer. So nothing controversial. And the other, yeah.
I saw you in the green.
A, you are correct. Yes, hundreds of pieces of rock used to make tools. And part of that, I'll go back to why I gave that answer. The pieces of tool, we know that people made them. There's a sloth and there's a mastodon, and they're really hotly debated exactly whether those projectile points were made by people or not, and how that was done. So you may be right, but I'm in charge. Oh, here's the answer. Oh, my, look at that, huh? Who knew? I didn't read this thing. I didn't read this thing. So, as it says, hundreds of pieces of a variety of different rock types were made into different points out there. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can see in Bear Creek, which is right near 520, to any evidence of this. So it's not worth going to. Sorry. So B, what is famous about the steamer Capital? A, it was the second steamer to arrive in Puget Sound. B, it was piloted by Bing Crosby's great-grand-uncle, Clanrick Cosby. Or C, after being abandoned by its captain, the paddle wheeler continued spinning and sort of walked across the tide flats at Olympia. Or D, it inspired Karl Marx to name one of his books. Who knows the answer? Yes, I see the over there. A, no, it is not the second steamer. In the pink. B, no. Way in the back there. C, you are correct. Oh, you are correct. There it is. That is the story. That the steamer just died and the captain got out. He thought it was going to blow up, and the paddle wheeler just kept paddling across. And as it says, Bing Crosby did have an ancestor with the name of Clanrick. Does anyone here have an ancestor with the name of Clanrick? No, it's another unusual name. Okay, so the Lachute name for Puget Sound is Walge, often written as Walsh, and the color just changed. What does it mean? Beautiful place, A, B, saltwater, C, home, D, none of the above. Did you have your hand up?
I did, but I was confused because you said like of the salt water, so I don't know if that counts as B or D.
Which one do you want to go with?
Oh, goodness, don't do this to me.
Go with B. B, excellent choice. Very good. Wow, that's great. And I think there's one more. Is this the next? Oh.
No, this is the last multiple choice.
Oh, last multiple choice. So this would be the fourth question. What is the oldest known animal collected in Puget Sound? 1, a 205-year-old rough-eye rockfish. B, a 173-year-old gooey duck. C, a 200-year-old red sea urchin. Or D, all of the above. Oh, there's over there, the hat line over. D. Was that D? C? D. D? No! And the blue face mask. No? Well, it's sort of tricky, I have to admit. So I see. You had your hand up. Right? A, correct. No, it is not. I gave you that. I didn't say that it was found in Puget Sound. I just said So we've got a couple more choices here. Yes. B, you said? B. B, you are correct. A 173-year-old gooey duck was found off of just north of Shoreline. What's the point that sticks out there? There's a park. Richmond Beach. And again, gooey duck, the way that, well, here, yeah. They count the growth rings on the shell. So the 205-year-old rockfish was found in Alaska, but we have that species here. And it's funny, with the sea urchins, the studies done, they project out that sea urchins could conceivably live to 200. I don't know if they're not easy to date. It's one of those sort of weird conceptual mathematic, Sure will do interpretive data later. And how many species of kelp live in Puget Sound? Do we have the answer? Is this?
It's the next slide, so don't give it away.
Oh, don't give it away. Yeah, in the back there.
2 dozen.
What?
2 dozen.
2 dozen, right on the nostrils. Excellent. Woohoo! We have a winner. So now I can do Q&A?
Yes.
Oh, so are there any questions that have nothing to do with this silliness up here? Do you have any questions for me? Yes. Oh. Oh wait, Sora's gonna bring a mic.
Yes.
The tie wearing person. You.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I know that you were primarily focused on the proper southern Puget Sound, but to the extent that we're looking at the greater, I'd be curious whether you've seen any interesting differences in the Canadian versus Washington management of the Sound, or treatment of the Sound since colonization.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't feel terribly qualified to address it, but I think the sort of key one that people really notice, and if you didn't hear it, the difference sort of between management, between north, if you will, the Strait of Georgia area, up north part of Salish Sea and the Puget Sound, Washington versus British Columbia. I mean, the big difference we see is between the northern resident orca and the southern resident orca. That, you know, our populations are really struggling. The northern ones are doing a lot better. There's fewer people. The management, I don't know all the details of the management up there, but the waterway is just in better shape up there. But I didn't look at it deeply enough to feel qualified to answer that. But thank you for asking.
Thank you.
There's a. Oh, 18. Whoops, I said 2 dozen. I'm going back on that. Go ahead, please.
Could you clarify the usage of Salish Sea and Puget Sound? I've heard both to mean different things, and now I'm really confused.
Yes. So the difference between Salish Sea and Puget Sound. So Puget Sound, for many people, technically is that area south of Admiralty Inlet. The Strait of Juan de Fuca then goes out to the coast, and the Strait of Georgia goes north up into Canada. Those 3 bodies of water make up the Salish Sea. It was a term that sort of started to be coined in the 80s. And I think it's a wonderful term, and I think it's one that acknowledges a central point, is that those are mixed waters, and that black line that crosses at the 49th parallel is irrelevant, and has certainly been irrelevant for thousands of years, and certainly from an ecological point of view. Though, as the question that was asked, there are obviously some differences because of management. But ultimately, the Salish Sea is the bigger body of water, and Puget Sound is just the southern part, the lower part of the waterway. Jennifer, behind you. Be nice, Jen, be nice.
Hi, David. It's so much fun to be at a talk of yours again in person. I'm wondering if what you said about individual action, and one of the things I've pondered is, would you say it's true that those sort of systemic influences of the things that are now Superfund sites actually have less impact on water quality and species than do the individual actions of cars driving and brake dust and things we flush down toilets? And so I'm just wondering, do you think that that's a fair statement, or do you think those Superfund sites are still just tremendously influential on the water quality?
Again, and a question I don't feel qualified to answer, but I do know, though, that this idea of point sources that are coming from us and all these different, there's so much out there. I mean, I guess the thing about that, a way to think about it, and I don't know if this is really answering your question, but it's arguable that Puget Sound is in better shape now than it's been in a long time. And one reason is that we have made systemic changes to the way things are managed, so that the Superfund sites, they're starting to be better about dealing with them and trying to clean them up. They're all very hard, and all these issues are very hard and very long term. And where we're seeing lots of problems now are these point source solutions where we don't know how to deal with them. And how do you say to everyone, okay, don't dump your pharmaceuticals down the toilet, don't do all these individual things. You drive a Prius and my car is electric. Well, if you put your brakes on, you're eroding the copper off, it gets into the water, that affects the same. We are all part of that system. So in sort of a big philosophical way, that's probably a bigger problem, because it then gets back to all of us, and it's easier to deal, in some ways easier to deal with these big Superfund sites, because there often is money, there often are ways to deal with it. But it's, yeah, they both suck. Other questions? I was like, quiet. Oh,
Thank you. In your interviews and discussions with people specific to salmon, what did you find to be hopeful about?
so I didn't hear that last.
When it comes to salmon and Puget Sound?
When it
during
comes to
your
salmon,
interviews,
yeah,
what do you find
that's a
hopeful about?
little bit tougher, to say the least. And I mean, I think it's just that potential, and to me it really boils down to that we want to try and do something. That doesn't mean we will, but as we start to learn, and maybe it's my just naive optimism about the world and belief that we can make this a better place, that people are working towards it. I understand being very pessimistic about them. Salmon, people were writing in the late 1800s that if we continue to build dams and we continue to have hatcheries and all the problems, and continue to harvest, we're going to destroy the population. We've been doing it for so long, but the fact that they're not gone, I guess, gives me some hope. And maybe that's a cop-out, but that's just how I feel. I mean, the fact that there is still this idea that we want to make it better. We want to. It's not, again, it's not going to be easy, but I have to believe that. I have to think that. It's just my worldview. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's who I am. So.
I'm wondering about place names. It seems like we honor the Europeans who came and Spanish and Americans who discovered places, but why do we keep those names and not change them to honor the original inhabitants?
Yeah, why don't we? And it's, people have been battling for how long to get Rainier back, which is sort of the basic name, and people like what they know, and they just want to stick with it. People don't want to change. I mean, I think changing the names back is great. It's wonderful to see that honoring of telling of story and connect, because it's these names. I mean, to me, I'd much rather have a name that is based on tens or dozens or hundreds of years of connection to place, instead of Rainier that was based on somebody's heading down the Sound, naming it after someone who never saw this place. It's hard enough to get people to, think about the basic things. I mean, we just want to change the name from something very simple, and we don't. I mean, how hard it's been to get the word squaw out, which is this horribly offensive term, and we can't. It's taken so long to do that. People just fundamentally don't like to change, and I also think people don't think about it. And I think the more we teach and the more we use these terms, the more people recognize them, and it comes with the territory as more and more people are going, wow, maybe that is wrong, then maybe we will see that change. But it's just hard, sadly. Yeah, that's a great question.
I have a question about birds and the Puget Sound. And my nephew is studying birds at University of Washington, and he does some Audubon walks at Union Bay.
Mm-hmm.
But I should probably ask him this. But since birds are such an indicator species of the health of the environment and what's going on, and we have to be we are so rich for birds in the Puget Sound area. What do you see as far as an interconnectedness with, the people who are managing the health of our sound, also addressing the birds? Because I know that there's an issue with too much light at night for the birds and airplanes and...
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The birds that face many, many issues in this area, and it depends on what species you're looking at. Some are doing okay. I mean, we certainly see a recovery of some of the bigger, better known ones. You know, eagles are doing well, and some of the other raptors, which is a response to the change in DDT. But I think a lot of these changes, and it's something that I think we sometimes are too impatient of what we want to happen. It took a long time to get to this point. It's going to take a long time to return to that longer recovery. And so some of again, some are doing well and some aren't. It just depends. And some of it then is not, and that to me was why I was trying to look at this from a, if you will, sort of a more integrated view, because when the herring are doing better, all the birds that revolve around herring, those birds do better. But because some of the herring populations are down, we're seeing some of the bird populations down. The shorebirds, or the birds that are taking advantage of them. So now as we're starting to try and focus on herring and think about the connectivity between herring, which is the connectivity with orca, which is connectivity with the fish that are using, which connects back to the birds, we are starting to see some improvement. But it's not all across the board. There's certain issues.
Yeah, that was where I was going with that,
Yeah.
is that interconnectedness that you spoke about between, sea life. It extends into birds and probably plants and trees. I mean, so that's sort of a newer mindset that the scientists are bringing to it. Is that what you
I
think?
think, yeah. I mean, I think one of the issues when I was first working on the book and interviewing people, I had a number of biologists who were saying, I would ask them, what's important? And they wouldn't say salmon. Because salmon, everyone gets salmon, but it's all these other species that are woven into that picture. The herring, and that the herring connect with, and the kelp. If you have healthy kelp populations, then the rockfish are doing well. And when rockfish are young, rockfish are also unusual. They give birth to live young. Those live young then are like forage fish, because a lot of fish eat them. So if you have healthy kelp, you have healthy rockfish. And if you have healthy herring, you have healthy orca and salmon. And so it's all, but people are starting to look at it that way. And I think that's, again, that's part of my hope, part of my hope of this place.
Yeah, that's been a big takeaway of your talk for me tonight, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, 2 other questions back there.
I wonder if you could talk about the Snake River dams and Puget Sound connection.
I can, to a very limited extent, because I did not do much research, but as people such as Linda Mapes have written about, and others, having those healthy orca, having the healthy salmon populations, and there again it gets back to that connectivity. If the healthy populations, if the orca are getting healthy fish populations in other areas, and they come back to this waterway healthier, then it's going to be a stronger waterway. So again, it's all that interconnectedness. I can't speak specifically beyond that. The better, it clearly has been shown that with the dams down, more salmon, everybody benefits. So there's another question right there. Yeah.
You talked about things improving as we increase knowledge. What's a question that's being asked right now whose answer will increase the knowledge in a way that benefits the ecosystem in the area?
I mean, I think one of the things that's come out, and again, it gets back, I'll just use rockfish as an example, because that's, to me, has been really important, is before they really started to look at rockfish, they didn't understand that relationship to kelp. And as they were looking at kelp, I mean, there's a whole working body group looking at kelp and trying to understand why are there changes in the kelp population. And as that fundamental aspect of the sound gets better understood, I think we will have that greater potential to have those stronger impacts. Just because it's that base of the ecosystem that so many things revolve around. Now, I'm not sure if that's answering your question or.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
So you mentioned indigenous knowledge. I was just wondering, because you said that it was kind of an example for stewardship and for management of the land. What does that look like when you say that it's important, like, are people or researchers like going to the tribes? Is there some sort of program or initiative to kind of collect the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we've starting to appear more and more with, particularly in biology, is what's called traditional ecological knowledge. And as that knowledge that indigenous people have, people living in the landscape and bringing those multi-generation viewpoint. For a long time, people just like, oh, the indigenous people, what they say, that's not science. It's just observation. And now as that's becoming more and more accepted, people are recognizing that, again, that the fingers get woven tighter and tighter with that traditional ecological knowledge. From a management point of view, one thing that we're seeing is there's the Suquamish tribe is starting to erect clam gardens. And these are these very low walls built on fairly shallow slopes, beaches, and they act as a way to sort of build up sediment where clams can be harvested and sort of planted in there. And this is technology, if you will, that goes back thousands of years. It's some of the oldest evidence we have for agriculture, really aquaculture in this region. And with that knowledge, as it's starting to be shared with other groups, there's Suquamish are returning this clam garden idea to the Sound, and hopefully that will spread out from there. So those are a couple examples. But it really is this idea of traditional ecological knowledge that's becoming more widespread, and people are looking at it more and trying to ask those questions. Instead of going in with answers or going in with a preconceived notion, biologists are starting to go in with more open eyes and not seeing what they expect to see, but seeing what they didn't realize they didn't know. And I think that's an amazing change.
I know that like marshes and stuff are good at filtering out pollutants before they reach waterways. Is there like an equivalent of that here, or is there like a main species that filters and kind of cleanses pollution?
Well, one of the big cleansers here are the oysters and the geoduck. I mean, because they're major filterers within the ecosystem. And one of the things that's sort of fascinating is that, again, it gets back to the Olympia oyster. The Olympia oysters, which were our native oyster and are our native oyster, that population was mostly hammered, and what we now have are Pacific or Japanese oysters, as they have often been called. Those are fairly widespread, but they're a big filter. So again, this restoration of Olympia oysters in the waterway is one of the essential aspects, is that filtration that they're doing.
The clam garden stuff, could doing that be helpful?
Yeah, they're all part of that system. Yeah, I mean they're helping it along, and it's really the little there's sort of small little aspects that all add up that the clam gardens are doing, and these sort of individual things that add in terms of filtration, in terms of more wildlife. So there's a lot going on with them. They're pretty wonderful.
Hi.
Hi.
Getting back to the kelp issue, I know I've read that there's been a lot of kelp forest wastage coming up from California and Oregon out on the coast, and a lot of it was tied to the sea star wasting and also the loss of these otters. Is the Puget Sound kelp forest pretty stable, or are they still like slammed by the loss of the sea stars and the proliferation of the sea urchins? And is there any kind of hope of them coming back?
Yeah, good question about what's up with the kelp forest here. Part depends on where you look. Overall, the population is down, but there are some areas where their improvement. For instance, that there's kelp in Elliott Bay, and historically they don't have a good record for that. And there are also quite a few groups now working on kelp restoration. But you're right, they have definitely been struggling in many areas. part of it is trying to understand exactly how much kelp was here, and that's an issue. But there's a lot of groups out now that are looking and trying to figure out what kelp is here, both the overstory and the understory species. But there's definitely some problems within it. But again, it's the fact that they're starting to try and do some restoration and more growth of them here is pretty exciting to see.
And I guess I was just wondering, have the sea stars started to recover some?
I think the big one is not doing as well, but the ochre and the ochre ones, which are purple, also are doing. We are seeing some improvement of those. At least I've certainly seen a lot more of them out there than I used to. So I think that's exciting.
Specifically thinking more so about like the regrades, like in the downtown area, I'm wondering, since you know a lot about this, how does that impact the waterways and how we're thinking about planning and thinking about the future when that urban shoreline has been changed so much, especially here in the downtown Seattle area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you're probably well aware, we removed a small hill just south of here called Denny Hill. We dumped most of it in a variety of different places. Much of it dumped right into Elliott Bay, just off of where the Beatles were fishing a few years ago. I think geologically, so 50 years is just a short geologic time. But that area and the whole water line, which is completely altered here, I think prior to the attempts that are going on with the seawall that are trying to improve that waterway. Yeah, I mean ultimately the thing about Elliott Bay is Elliott Bay itself is relatively small and to the whole length of the sound. Within the waterway, yeah, it's not in the best shape because of all the concrete and the regrade material that's dumped in there. The bigger concern is actually from a potential, from the Denny Hill, when it was dumped into Elliott Bay, was literally just sort of dumped in, and there's a big mound just off the surface, under the surface out there. And the concern with that is actually more from a landslide point of view, that if there's a big earthquake, and that could trigger a landslide of this mound, which then could create some sort of tsunami-like wave within Elliott Bay. So just another thing for you to be concerned about. Sorry for that uplifting. You should never talk to geologists.
I think we have time maybe for one more.
Where are you? You're high. Where'd you go? I did too. I thought you ran away.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more before we do the signing, book signing.
Oh,
yes.
way up front.
Yes, make me walk. Thank you.
Are you gonna ask a nice question like, when do you expect to win your next Pulitzer?
Okay, so here's the last question. You mentioned Linda Mapes, and so I would like to do a shout out to the Seattle Times because they excerpted your book. Is that not right? Yeah. And I read the excerpt, and then I bought the book. So anyway, there's you're doing wonderful work here, and I think I love the idea that you don't take the iconic species of the salmon and start with those and the orcas, but rather you're along the shoreline and where the little fish are hanging out, and the system really does rest on those. But also, again, a shout out to the Times because they are on this all the time, and you can't pick up a Sunday paper without pictures and some way addressing this too. So anyway, that. It's not a question. It's just.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and I think it is important to recognize. I think the Seattle Times, for as many troubles as it has, does do a pretty amazing job on their environmental and many sections. I think it's actually we're pretty lucky to have a paper like that. There's one. Well, I'll take the blue question.
Okay, I'm going to shout out to your libraries because check out Linda Mapes' book on the OWA. It's beautiful and it's fantastic.
Yeah, Linda's a wonderful, fabulous, nifty, amazing person. Much nicer than I am. I will make one, if I may make a selfish statement. Well, one, I want to thank all of you for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. But two, Obviously, there's books for sale out there, which you should take advantage of. But the other thing is that somewhere around here, there's some postcards. I think they're up by where the book signing is going to be. I also write a weekly newsletter, a free weekly newsletter that covers all aspects of human and natural history in this area. And I wish I could remember what I did last week. It really annoys me. Does anyone get the newsletter? Remember what I did last week? No, that's really bad. I know tomorrow's is going to be on mountain goats. But it comes out, it's sort of my continuing way of trying to share this information and I hope create a community of people. I love to get comments. I love being reminded about what I wrote about. I was just talking to a friend of mine. It's my 40th high school reunion this year. Like, oh my God, I can't remember anything. But more important than anything, it's been very much a pleasure to answer your questions, to share the stories of this place, to share the community of those who are concerned about this amazing place. I say it over and over again when I do programs. I know that we are incredibly blessed with this fabulously beautiful, dynamic ecosystem. And because of that, I think we all face a responsibility to be kinder, gentler to the landscape and to each other. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. Before we get to the book signing, I've got a couple last things. Thank you, David. And thank you to our partners at History Link. Yay! It would be really great if you're interested in helping us continue to create these adult history education opportunities, if you could please take our survey with my colleague Phaedra in the back. She has some QR codes, some pencils and papers. It would really help us out. You can enter to win a raffle. And join us for our next History Cafe, which will be on April 19th with UW professor Devin Narr, which will be Seattle's Sephardic Jews in the 20th century. So please join us for that. Hold on, I have a slide here. Wait, yes, there. So join us on the 19th. So thank you again, David.